Professor of International Business and Associate Director of the David Lamb Center for International Communication. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. J.W.Berry, who is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Queen's University. This is the second time that Professor Berry has graced us with his appearance at the Pacific Region Forum. The first time was a number of years back, but we couldn't remember the exact year. It was close to the time when Platoon was introduced in Canada. Dr. Berry received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and has received honorary doctorates from the University of Athens and Dr. Berry has published over 30 books in areas of cross-cultural, social, and cognitive psychology. Today he'll talk about acculturation, living successfully in two cultures. Dr. Berry's presentation will be followed by a Q&A period. Without further ado, I'll turn the podium to John.
Thank you very much, Rosalie, for the introduction and for the invitation. It's always nice to come to the most livable city in the world, as we found out this morning in the newspaper. And although I come from another culture, I have adapted reasonably well to this one in the last 24 hours. The talk I'm going to work through with you deals with the question that I think all of us know about, if not professionally, we certainly know about personally, and that is in the highly interculturalized world in which we live, none of us really is able to remain culturally isolated from those whose background, whether it's linguistic, religious, value system, or any other aspect of how they've been raised. We cannot remain isolated from interactions with people different from us. And the concept of acculturation was introduced almost 130 years ago now to refer to the kinds of changes that we experience both collectively as groups and individually in terms of our own personal psychology after the contact between people of different cultural backgrounds. The talk I've prepared has basically two parts. One is an introduction to some of the conceptual approaches that those of us in cross-cultural psychology use when studying acculturation. And then I'm going to turn to an example of the kind of study that has been done in cross-cultural psychology, which is a 13-country study of immigrant youth. It will appear in the spring as a book, as a research monograph. And what I have to show you are some of the more salient results from that study to illustrate the kinds of work that is underway. And at the end of that particular study, and I suppose working back into the first part as well, I'll try to come up with some conclusions and policy implications, some strategies to suggest what the data tell us about living successfully when we are interacting with persons of another culture. I was saying to Rosalie and Jan over lunch that I only started using PowerPoint earlier this year, so I see I have a blank slide here. I hope there's something on the next one. Yes, success. The usual acknowledgement. I went from Montreal to Edinburgh to Australia for a number of years and came back to Canada in '69. So it's been about 35 years that I've been feeding at the trough of the SSHRC, Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and also the funding wing of Multiculturalism Ministry in its various guises. And much of the work I'm going to talk about conceptually and empirically stems from their support. outline of the talk is in two slides here. The first, an introduction, and I'm going to say a few words about why I think studies of acculturation are important. And then to introduce you to the concept of acculturation as it's used in anthropology and psychology. And then I'm going to ask three questions indicated here by sections 3, 4, and 5. First of all, are there variations in how people go about this process of acculturation, or do they all do it in the same way? Well, the answer, very simply, is that there are very large variations. There are both group, individual, and societal variations in how people try to manage their relationships following contact. That's the question number 3, which I call the how. The second of these three questions is, are there variable outcomes for people? Are there differences in how well people manage to establish their lives living interculturally? That's the how well question. Using the notions of adaptation, both psychological and sociocultural. And then, for me, the big question is, are there any systematic relationships between how people go about their acculturation and how well they adapt? Does it matter how you try to live in your new social and cultural setting for whether it's going to be a successful outcome or not? And that's the third question here. Are relationships evident between the how question and the how well question? Then I'll try to come up with some conclusions. In the answer to this, my attempted to answer this question, I'll be talking about this project called ICSI, the International Comparative Study of Ethnocultural Youth, as an example. So to go back to the first, the acculturation, as I said at the outset, is a fact of life. Intercultural contact takes place daily, whether you travel or stay at home, whether you migrate or whether you're sedentary. Nobody is immune from intercultural relations. For a lot of people, for a long time, cultural contact has been thought of as a source of conflict, as a source of problems. We talk about immigrant problems. We talk about societies with immigrants having problems. But in fact, I think the long-term evidence now tells us that immigration and other forms of intercultural contact bring about as many positive opportunities and outcomes as they do negative ones. So there's been a shift in the literature away from the negative side of studying acculturation, and particularly immigrant acculturation, to the idea that immigration and intercultural contact more generally is a source of human enrichment. It's a source of growth. It's a source of novelty. It's a source of self-insight. And, of course, a source of mutual understanding, rather than the older idea that it's a source of conflict. One possible reason for the earlier view of it being problematic comes from the source of the information. Anthropologists studied acculturation under colonial settings where, of course, there was conflict. The big guys wanted the land and resources of the small guys. So the very purpose of the contact was conflictual in essence. In immigration studies in the early part of the 20th century, most studies were carried out by clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers who made their living finding problems and trying to solve them. So there was a kind of vested interest in seeing acculturation as a problematic life experience. In the middle part of the 20th century, more and more epidemiological kinds of studies started to be carried out, community-based surveys, and there we found, I think in general, it is a positive experience for most people. Most people have settled in, reestablished their lives, gained many of the goals that they immigrated to achieve, and in the second generation, there are advances in the quality of human life that were part of the motivation to immigrate in the first place. Now, the second topic here is the concept of acculturation itself. I've already indicated very briefly that it was a term introduced by anthropologists to refer to the changes that occur at both the societal level and the individual level as a result of contact between people of two different cultural backgrounds. And I've also made mention that a lot of acculturation took place as a result of colonial expansion. We in the minority world, that is to say the Western world, tend to forget that this process has been going on for thousands of years. In India, I remind people that they took over Southeast Asia as far as Bali a few thousand years ago. Then Chinese took over other parts of Asia. And, of course, the Arab world took over whole parts of North Africa as part of the Islamic expansion. So what we're seeing now is, what I'm trying to convey is a reminder that colonial expansion leading to a cultural experience is not to be understood simply as a result of European colonial expansion in the last 500 years or contemporary migration flows. It's a normal, natural, inevitable, continuing process that's part of human history. Even at a broader level, of course, evidence shows clearly that we all have our human roots in Africa, and Africans went to the Middle East or West Asia, and from there they went to Asia, to Europe, and from there they went to North and South America. So the first peoples didn't have contact with others, but everybody else since then has. So it's a long-term process. The cultural and the psychological level indicated there is illustrated in this framework, which comes from a chapter I published a couple of years ago in a book called Acculturation, Research and Theory. It's an attempt to portray the two levels, the cultural or group level of the phenomena we're interested in, and the psychological or individual level. The anthropological tradition has largely remained at the cultural or group level of phenomena, whereas when psychologists got into it, we looked at and sampled and tried to understand individuals. Right? So when anthropologists studied acculturation, they looked at features of the two cultures in contact and the nature of their contact arrangements. So if we're talking about European invasion of North America, we knew that there was a certain goal, a certain imbalance in power, and the features of the two cultures in contact led to changes in both of the cultures in contact. There's a very interesting study by an anthropologist by the name of Bailey in New Brunswick, who pointed out that in the first generation, European peoples settling in eastern Canada acquired more cultural attributes from indigenous peoples than did indigenous peoples acquire from the Europeans. Everything that was necessary for survival in the New World came from knowledge rooted in the indigenous population. So the flow isn't always from, or I should say the dominant are not always dominant. And that's a good lesson to learn, because those who are currently dominant are not going to be dominant forever and ever. The nature of the contact situation changed. Initially, European in eastern Canada were learning how to live here, and so they had to subscribe to and learn and acquire certain characteristics, and had to treat people on a more or less equitable basis. Thereafter, the large power, economic and military and political power difference led to one of domination. So the contact situation also needs to be studied. And then, of course, changes in both cultural systems. We all know, particularly if you've read the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples reports, the long-term instability and devastation of indigenous peoples in this country, and indeed every country, and their resilience. It's amazing. After 500 years, people who were the object of takeover, assimilation, residential schools, political manipulation, still live, and live with a sense of who they are. So the changes occur in the non-dominant culture, but they also change in the dominant culture. All you have to do is look at cities like Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, to see how immigration has massively transformed the institutions and the character generally of the cities in which people reside. So both cultures change. So at the anthropological level, there is substantial interest in knowing how whole groups of people go about their interactions and what kinds of changes result. I wanted to spend a little time emphasizing that the dominant culture changes, because so much acculturation research has focused only on the non-dominant partner. And from the early 1970s, with Rudy Kalin at Queen's and Don Taylor at McGill, we've been tracking through national surveys how the Canadian population in general has responded to, attitudinally and behaviorally, to the changing nature, the changing cultural demography of the Canadian population. That's very rare in acculturation studies, but it's important to track this. In the 60s, it actually was an anthropologist, Graves, proposed that just as whole societies or cultural groups change, individuals who are members of those groups also change. And we have to look at the way in which people deal with the contact situation and figure out how they're going to live as individuals, as members of families, in the new setting. So the notion of psychological acculturation came into the field. And here we make a distinction between two kinds of phenomena. One, the behavioral changes or behavioral shifts which occur over time and relatively free of conflict. It's difficult, but you learn another language. It's difficult, but you change your diet. It's difficult, you change the way you dress. It's difficult, but you change the way you address people. These behavioral shifts are part of the process of psychological acculturation. Some features, however, are more problematic. And many of you probably know the notion of culture shock, which I prefer not to use because shock is always negative. I prefer the notion of stress because sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Stress challenges the individual to respond in a way that will allow them to get on with their life. And the source is in acculturation, not in culture. So I prefer the notion of acculturative stress to refer to the challenges and the reactions and the solutions that people undergo as a result of experiencing culture contact situations that are not easy to deal with, but are more problematic. So this distinction is quite common now in our field. And finally, although acculturation never ends, you probably are a different person today from the person you were a week ago before you met person X from culture Y. But it's commonly accepted that people settle into a pattern, a way of living interculturally that meets their particular needs. And so we talk about adaptation, longer-term outcomes, in both cultures again, and there are distinctions in the literature which are now, I think, pretty well founded between psychological aspects and sociocultural aspects. Psychological aspects are internal to yourself, a sense of well-being, a sense of self-esteem, a sense that you are in charge of your life. Whereas the sociocultural adaptation notion refers to your relationships and competence in dealing with people outside of yourself, both in your own culture and in the other culture with which you are in contact. This includes, for example, for youth doing well in school, or for adults doing well in the world of work, and social relationships. And it covers everything from relatively mundane aspects, such as figuring out how to use the telephone system in a foreign country or the public transportation system, through to dealing with government bureaucracy or filling out income tax forms, learning the laws, and so on. It is essentially how well the person has been able to adapt to the broader sociocultural context. The reason for spending some time on this particular slide is to show you the wide range of concepts, the wide range of phenomena that a complete study of acculturation would need to examine. We need to know the dominant culture, the non-dominant culture, how they are interacting, what the changes have been occurring in their communities, how individuals change in their day-to-day behavior, what difficulties they're experiencing, and what the long-term outcomes are. A lot of studies, however, simply look at this last box. They look at, say, for example, school performance or psychiatric records or problems of gang behavior and so on, without any serious attempt to understand this whole complex of background factors that I think are so important in interpreting any of these longer-term outcomes. The next slide is also a background conceptual one that I think you will recognize as being very important when I come to showing the data from the study that I'm going to report with immigrant youth. For a long time, just as negative outcomes were thought to be the main ones, for a long time it was assumed that the result of interaction between groups of people, one dominant and one non-dominant, would be the eventual assimilation or absorption, disappearance of the non-dominant per group into the dominant. Some of you may recognize the following quote: "All the peoples of North America are destined by divine providence to be one people, speaking one language, and sharing one set of values under God." That's Quincy Adams portraying the future of North America in 1825. All the peoples of North America, etc., etc. Well, it's obviously not happened, and it's not going to happen. In fact, it's probably moving in the opposite direction. So the concept of assimilation, which you'll see there, which used to be the dominant ideology in Canada and virtually every other immigrant receiving society, and still dominates a lot of social science research, began to be challenged about 25 or 30 years ago. And when I was working in Australia with Aboriginal populations, there was an event which led to the development of this framework. I was teaching a night course to Aborigines in downtown Sydney, a race relations course, and that particular day the Prime Minister announced a policy shift. He said, henceforth, all Australian Aborigines will become Australian like all other Australians. In other words, he was saying that the old policy of segregation and derogation was going to be set aside, and they were going to be assimilated. And of course, this caused an uproar in the Australian Aboriginal population. They believed, quite rightly from my point of view, that they should have a say in how they want to live in Australia. And this is a reaction that's common to every other cultural group that I've ever studied. To what extent do they want to be absorbed, made to be disappeared in the Argentinian or Chilean sense? So we said in a letter to the Prime Minister, this is a very important issue. We think that Australian Aborigines should be consulted. Months later, after we started a research project, we got a letter which was probably the most racist I've ever seen. It said, "This is a very complex question. It would take a very sophisticated mind to understand it, and hence we don't think consulting with Aborigines would be useful." Anyway, we started some ethnographic work which led to the belief, continuing belief, that there are two major issues that every acculturating individual needs to come to some resolution of. And this is true of the non-dominant or ethnocultural communities and of the dominant or larger society in general. And the two issues are these. One, to what extent is it important for me, my family, my community, my society, my people, to what extent is it important for me to maintain my cultural heritage and cultural identity? And we find views going all the way from strongly yes through to strongly no for both groups. The second issue is the one of intercultural contact. To what extent do I want to reach out from my own cultural group and have day-to-day interactions and participate with people other than my own in the larger society? Again, some people can answer, yes, I want to reach out. Others say, no, I want to turn my back and not be involved at all. These, by the way, are the two major themes underlying the Canadian multiculturalism policy. And despite the astuteness of the recent appointment of the new Governor General, she still thinks that this is the only issue underlying in the multiculturalism policy. The issue of participation and change in both communities in contact is largely forgotten. In fact, this is the dominant element in Canadian multicultural programs at the present time. So when you allow these two issues to intersect, you create an acculturation space. And in this space, there are different sectors that define different strategies. Assimilation is the strategy when people do not want to maintain their cultural heritage and to be fully involved, even absorbed into the larger society along with all other groups. The opposite, a term we know well and in other parts of the world known well as well, separation is when you value your cultural heritage very strongly, but want to do it having as little as possible interaction with people who are different from yourself. You want to separate yourself. You want to turn your back. The integration option here is when people want to maintain the integrity of their heritage culture, plus, but want to be an integral participant, partner in the daily life of the larger society. So the term integration was used in this scheme starting in the late 60s for this particular double plus option. Note that it's very different from assimilation, which involves cultural loss. A lot of people use them simultaneously, but in my scheme, they're quite different. And I think whether you use them as synonyms, you still need to have another word then for this double plus. And of course, the well-known sector where people don't particularly value or have access in order to value their heritage culture, and for a whole variety of reasons remain outside full participation. This is the marginalization way of living interculturally. From the point of view of the dominant society, you have this melting pot ideology. There's one people, one culture, e pluribus unum, for example. You have segregation when it's forced on people by the dominant society. You have full-scale exclusion, both down and out, as a way of living. And the multicultural policy in Canada, and to some extent Australia, and until a few weeks ago in the Netherlands, is one that incorporates both dimensions positively. Yes, it's fine to maintain your heritage, culture, and identity, and on that basis, it's great to have full participation and acceptance in the larger society. This relates to the how question that I proposed earlier. Do people vary in how they want to acculturate? And we are guided in our search for an answer to that question using this particular framework. In the study I'm going to show you, we do have some data from the larger society, but it's not part of my presentation. But I'm going to focus on the ethnocultural group members. So to switch to that study that I mentioned, the International Comparative Study of Immigrant Youth, ICSI. There's a book called Immigrant Youth in Cultural Transition coming out, Lawrence Earlbaum Associates, in about March. And there are four of us who are the coordinators of the project. Myself, Jean Finney. From Los Angeles, David Sam, who is a Ghanaian in Bergen in Norway, and Paul Vetter, who is in Leiden in the Netherlands. The 13 countries are listed here, and members of the research team. We had multiple sites in Australia, and so we have a number of co-authors. Cynthia Leung, Cynthia Fan as she was then, working with Chinese in Sydney and Melbourne. Rogelio Papua, Filipina, working with the Philippine community in Sydney. Rosie Rooney and David Sang from Western Australia. David, a Vietnamese immigrant. Kyung Hwa Maikor, cooperator, colleague in Queens, immigrant from Korea. Carmela Liebkin in Finland. Carlette Sabatier, who's one of my postdocs, now back in France. Paul Schmitz in Germany. Gabriel Horenchuk, who's an immigrant from Argentina. Vetter and Van de Viver, Colleen Ward, who's originally from Nolans, as she calls it, N-A-W-L-I-N-S, New Orleans, but has been living in Singapore and New Zealand for many years. David Sam, Ghanaian, working in Norway. Felix Neto in Portugal. Charles, who runs the Center for Ethnic Research in the University of Stockholm, Erkki Virta, who is a Swedish Finn, Lena Robinson, who's a South Asian social worker, and Jean Finney, who's a psychologist. So we had a multidisciplinary and international team. The 13 societies of settlement in which we worked, and let me just mention that most acculturation does not take place in these societies. You've got 10 million Afghanis in Pakistan, for example. You've got millions of people displaced in West Asia and in Africa. So acculturation phenomena exist very, very much outside the framework of the focus of this particular study. What we did was to choose societies that we call settler, colonial, and recent. Settler societies are those countries on which their contemporary social and political arrangements are based upon immigration from many parts of the world. Australia, Canada, Israel, New Zealand, and the US. These are societies that are in the immigration business. They seek out and they attempt to settle new people. Former colonial societies are those who settled other parts of the world and have been receiving for about 50 years large numbers from their former colonies. France, Germany, we tend to forget that Germany had colonies, Britain, and the Netherlands and Portugal. And then we have those who are recently in the business of receiving immigrants and trying to understand and deal with them, and that is Norway, Sweden, and Finland. We think that the history of immigration and acculturation experiences will influence how well as possibly how the young people are doing. We have immigrant youth from 32 different countries. The largest number, 7 of the 13 from Vietnam, 6 of the 13 from Turkey, 4 from South Asia, 3 from China, and many with single sources. For example, North African in France, Koreans in Canada. The size of the sample, you can see here. We have immigrant youth and their parents, 1 parent per youth, some mothers, some fathers. And we have a comparable sample, national youth from the same school districts in which the immigrant youth came from, about half the size, and some, but with less cooperation, some of their parents. So although I'm not going to deal with it particularly in this talk, we can compare immigrant youth with their parents. We can compare immigrant youth with national youth. We can compare discrepancies between immigrant youth and their parents to the discrepancies that we find between national youth and their parents to try to get at some of the family dynamics issues. There is a conference coming up later this month on immigrant families, which I'll be dealing with the other aspects. The framework for this particular study, you will, I think, recognize, although my computer skills are obviously in evidence, lacking of computer skills. We have some features at the group or contextual level. Where are these people coming from? And then, as psychologists mostly, we are interested in the individual level. We have context variables, immigration. To what extent is society built on immigration? Pluralism. To what extent is cultural pluralism a valued and accepted way of living in the society? Will Kimlicka, whose work some of you probably know, he's also at Queen's along with Keith Batting, have just published a paper using 9 criteria identifying high through to low acceptance of pluralism in about 40 different societies. And then group differences. There's this idea that the greater the cultural difference between 2 groups in contact, the greater will be the difficulties of having a successful adaptation. And we looked at differences in cultural values, differences in religion, and differences in so-called race, visible differences. The intercultural variables and the adaptation variables are considered to be related. These are largely the how aspects, and these are the how well aspects. So we have the acculturation attitudes or acculturation strategies that I talked about. We have the cultural identity, the identity with the new national society as well as with their heritage group. Language proficiency and use, social contacts, perceived discrimination, and family relationship values. In adaptation, we have psychological adaptation and sociocultural adaptation. psychological, self-esteem, life satisfaction, and psychological problems. And sociocultural adaptation involves how well they're doing in school and how well they're doing in the community. Truancy, petty crime, gang behavior, and so on. As influenced by the usual variables, control variables that we try to take care of. The age of the youth, the gender, socioeconomic status of the family, how long they've resided, generational status first or second, and neighborhood composition. Generational status, we didn't include first versus second. We used proportion of life spent in the new society. So in the age range 13 to 18, if an 18-year-old was born in the country, he got 100% proportion of life spent. And a 13-year-old born in the society was 100%. So we made the assumption that if you're born outside the country of settlement, that would contribute certain psychological and cultural attributes, and these would confront those that they encountered on the arrival in the new society. So we gave up using generational status because it's fairly arbitrary. For example, if a child comes at age 5, are they first or second generation? Well, from the point of view of their socialization into the new into the community, they're really first generation, but technically, they're really second generation, but technically they're first generation. So we gave up on that. And these are important control variables. Now, in the last few years, a particular kind of analysis has come into vogue. It comes, I think, from marketing studies. It's a kind of cluster analysis. Instead of bringing your variables together into coherent clusters of variables, we did that as well. But in this particular analysis I'm going to show you now, we brought people together based upon their scores on the intercultural variables that I showed you in the last slide. The magic machine, Paul Vedder does our magic button pressing, identified 4 and only 4 clusters of individuals based upon their responses to the intercultural variables. And I'll tell you in a minute how they are made up. But 36% were in the cluster that we call the integration variable. These are people who are oriented towards both cultures, a balanced bicultural orientation. Ethnic, mainly oriented towards their ethnocultural community. National, mainly oriented towards the new society. And diffuse, confused, a pattern that suggested that they didn't know how to be living. Notice that the largest is integration, and this corresponds with a lot of the earlier literature. The second largest is not assimilation, but it's third. It's in fact fourth in frequency. The second largest, and almost equal in second place, second largest is ethnic and diffuse. So if we ask the question, are there variations in how youth are trying to live during their acculturation experience? The answer that we get is yes, there are 4 discernible, distinct differences. If we ask, what are they trying to be part of the national society and forget their heritage culture? The answer is very clearly no, because the 2 highest have very strong components of their heritage culture. So the answer to the how question is yes, there are variations, and these variations have strong links to their heritage culture. Now, I used earlier the notion acculturation strategies, and some people object to this. They say that a strategy is something that you actively engage in, that you deliberately decide on, and you pursue as a way of living. And why not just call them attitudes or preferences? Well, this is an attempt to convince you that we have attitudes or preferences. We have attitudes towards assimilation, towards integration, towards separation, towards marginalization. We also have identities, which are feelings of attachment. They're quite different from attitudes. We have behaviors, the languages they know and use and with whom. We also have social contacts, the kinds of people they hang out with from their own heritage culture and from the larger society. And we also have evidence from relationships linked to traditional family values of authority and independence within the family. So they're more than just attitudes, these 4 profiles, so I'm calling them strategies. The integration profile, the one that I said is the most common, about 36%. I'll just run through the intercultural variables. Integration, separation, assimilation, marginalization. These are their attitudes on a 20-item scale, preferring the integration way, separation way, assimilation way, or marginalization way of living. We then have identity as a member of their heritage culture and identity as a member of the larger national society in which they're living. Then we have language, knowledge, and proficiency in the ethnic language, the same for the national language. And this one is a single-dimension bipolar use scored in the direction of national language predominating. In other words, a high score on this means when they're out in the community, it doesn't matter how much they know either language. The high score means they use the national language more than the ethnic language. Ethnic peer contacts, who do they hang out with outside school, in the community, in clubs. National peer contacts, who do they hang out from the national society. And we have family obligations, a sense that they have obligations to the family, and their sense that they have rights. Who to date, who to marry, how to spend their free time. So look at this profile. Integration, these are standardized scores. Integration profile is positive, and they reject, the integration attitude is positive, they reject the other 3 ways. As I mentioned before, integration involves cultural maintenance and participation in the larger society. What would you expect? That their identities with their ethnic group and the national society would both be positive. Language, knowledge, and competence in both languages, positive. Involvement with peers of both societies, positive. And an acceptance of obligations within the family, the traditional family structure, and also a sense of rights, which come largely from being an immigrant in a society where children's rights are more predominant. The ethnic, low attitude towards integration, particularly low towards assimilation and marginalization, but high towards separation. High identity with their own ethnic group, low, very low identity with the national society. High ethnic language, low national language, high ethnic peer interaction, low national peer interaction, and higher sense of obligations. And what we don't quite understand is why they would have slightly higher claim to rights. The mirror image is the national profile, and one slide I have them side by side so you can see. This, if you were to just flip the previous slide, you would get this one. High assimilation, low integration, but notice, and separation, but notice also somewhat high marginalization. Both of these, assimilation and marginalization, involve loss of your heritage culture. Low ethnic language, high national language, low ethnic language, somewhat high on both the, these are the identities. Low national identity, low ethnic identity, high national identity, and the profile you'll see going right along, including the family relationship values. And the novel finding, I think, out of all of this is the notion of a diffuse profile. Jean Finney, who works in the area of identity, has taken this from the Ericksonian and Martian traditions. These are people who are low on integration, which conceptually is opposite to marginalization, but they are positive with respect to the other 3 ways, and particularly to assimilation and marginalization. They are low on both identities. They don't have a strong identity. They're high on their ethnic language, but very low on the national language, so they haven't the means to become involved and interact. They're high on ethnic peer involvement, low on national peer involvement, and they're somewhat lower in family relationships. In other words, probably signaling some dysfunction. So my answer, again, to the question, are there variations in how youth are trying to live in the new society? My answer is very strongly yes. There are very clear differences, and these differences are partially replications of what was known before and partially extensions. What about length of residence? Do people change in their profiles? So here we used length of residence under 6 years, 6 to 12, and over 12 years. So the 18-year-olds are the ones who were born. If you look at the integration profile, it goes up. People over time have figured out that it's fine to be culturally who you are, your family is, and it's possible on that basis at the same time to participate in the larger society. Elsie Ho, who's worked with Chinese adolescents from Hong Kong and New Zealand, has also tracked acculturation attitudes over time. And over 3 years, longitudinal study, the trend is for increasing acceptance of integration, although at first arrival it was sometimes higher for assimilation, sometimes higher for separation. The diffuse, the black, dramatic decrease. In the first 6 years, utter confusion for large numbers, percent, almost 50%. But over time, it drops down to almost 10%. They figure out that there are other ways than being confused when living. The national goes up somewhat, not dramatically. The ethnic drops a little bit, but not in a statistically significant way. So what we find is there's no great loss in a sense of their involvement and attachment to the ethnic society. There is a slight increase in the national, a stronger increase in integration, and a dramatic decrease in the diffusion. In demographic studies, when we look at where people live, if you look at adults, people choose where to live. Not always, but often they can decide to live in this neighborhood or another. For kids, they don't make that choice. So here we have 5 categories. These are kids who live in a neighborhood where almost everybody is unlike their own cultural group. And over here, everybody, or almost everybody, is your own cultural group. In between, it's balanced and majority other and majority own. What you see is a rise and a fall in the integration profile, and an inverse drop in the diffuse profile here, and changes in the national profile going down, and changes in the ethnic profile going up very slightly, particularly when it's a kind of ghetto, when it's all your own group. So here we think both the length of residence and the neighborhood composition are kind of validation of these 4 ways of living. What about the relationship between identities and the kind of society? In earlier analysis, we found that people in Australia, Canada, and the US had high ethnic identities and high national identities, whereas people in Norway, Sweden, and Finland had high ethnic identities but very low national identities. So in the recent receiving societies, there hasn't been figured out that you can really feel you belong in a sense of attachment to the new society in which you're living. Whereas the so-called settler societies, it's figured out that you can be both and have high identities. But the question arises, what are the correlations? In the settler societies, except Israel, the correlations between feelings of attachment to your own cultural group and to the national society are all positive. There's no conflict, no contrast felt. But in Israel, it's essentially 0. In the former colonial societies, they're all negative. People feel that the more they are one, the less they must be the other. And in the recent societies, they're all negative as well. So the countries that have been in the immigration and settlement business for a longer time, the settler societies, have youth living in them who are able to identify with both. And this is the current debate in Europe. Virtually none of the large immigrant communities have been able to bring themselves to identify with and commit themselves to the European societies. And for them, as I alluded to very briefly before, multiculturalism has simply meant living a separate existence. Yes?
Oh, does it have to do with the language which the society speaks with? For instance, with several societies, all of them are English-speaking countries, and if you look at former colonial, with UK, there's a positive correlation. So does it have to do with the English being...
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. We actually hadn't thought of that. We know from our Finnish colleague that the Finnish language being more difficult because it's a completely different language family, has one of the lowest rates of identification with the national society. So, yeah, ease of language acquisition or prior knowledge could well be a factor. Just like everything in psychology, particularly cross-cultural psychology, for every neat attempt at an explanation, there's a more complex variable that could well contribute some explanation. But essentially what I'm saying, and I use this when I talk in Europe, there's a reciprocity of attitudes. And this is where we go to the other side of the coin, the attitudes in the dominant society. If the message constantly is, we don't want you here, we don't like you, or we don't like you the way you are, what's the probable attitude in return? It's going to be reciprocated. It's going to be a rejection of the national society. So attitudes towards immigrants and immigration tend to be more positive in the societies where immigration is seen as a normal, natural, continuing process of national society building. In another study, which I'll be reporting on next summer in Greece, called ISATIS, International Study of Attitudes Towards Immigrants and Settlement, we have some parallel analyses, but they're not complete yet. Looking at identity, though, by length of residence across all of the societies, there is a gradual increase in identification with the national society. And the reason I don't have one for the ethnic identity is that there's no variation. It remains flat. Perceived discrimination, which didn't go into the intercultural variables because we knew from other analyses, which I'll show you shortly, stands alone as the single most important contributor to the adaptation outcomes. So we analyze it separately. The perception of discrimination. This is a scale developed by Dan Hockoy for a graduate thesis with me at Queen's. Perception of me as a person being discriminated against because I'm a member of a particular group, and my group being discriminated against. I know that Steve Wright here in the psychology department has written a lot on the distinction between perception of discrimination against me as an individual and perception of discrimination against my group. And very often people say, oh no, I haven't been the object of discrimination myself, but most members of my group have been. But here we couldn't find such a distinction. Now to go to the third question, actually the second question, psychological adaptation and sociocultural adaptation. Psychological adaptation in factor analysis turned out to include the lack of psychological problems. Let me just go back, take that off. That's where the blank should have been. One of the important indicators of psychological distress in immigrants is anxiety. Uncertainty about how to behave, how to interact in the new intercultural encounters. The second is depression, which is classically linked to loss, homesickness, nostalgia. And a third is the existence of a variety of psychosomatic problems. Tics, stomach problems, bowel problems, sweating, and so on. And these all come together with two other variables, a sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and a sense of psychological well-being. And these create a variable for us called psychological adaptation. And the third question I asked, is there a relationship between how and how well? What we find here is a dramatic answer that indeed the psychological well-being or psychological adaptation for young people, immigrant youth, in these 4 profiles, standardized scores, those who are in the integration profile and to a slightly lesser extent those in the ethnic profile have positive psychological outcomes. Those in the national, but most dramatically those in the diffuse profile, have very negative psychological outcomes. In other words, they have anxiety, depression, poor sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and a poor sense of personal well-being. So the third question, is there a relationship? Yes, very strongly. What about sociocultural adaptation, which I mentioned earlier, brings together in this study the ability to do well in school, to like school, and to be accepted by your teachers, with lack of difficulties in the community on the street, truancy, smoking, drug addiction, alcohol, bullying, and so on. The answer is rather similar, but one thing that is different from our expectations are these 2 middle bars. We fully expected integration to be positive and diffuse to be negative, but we expected the national profile, people, to have a more positive sociocultural adaptation, because after all, this variable brings together relationships between the young person and people and institutions of the larger society. The ethnic is more or less corresponding. In other words, the more ethnist you are, the less likely you are to develop the competencies in school and in the neighborhood. I'll just take a couple more minutes. In addition to the profiles, we also did the standard factor analyses and used those variables in a structural equation model. And I'll just run you. So this is another way. It's slicing it at a different angle. A national orientation is a factor that brings together assimilation attitudes, national identity, and national language use. An ethnic orientation brings together a separation attitude with ethnic identity with ethnic language use. Integration brings together integration attitudes positively with marginalization attitudes negatively. And ethnic behaviors brings together a whole bunch of the variables dealing with relationships with your own community. Perceived discrimination stands alone, and down here, sociocultural and psychological adaptation are massively suppressed by discrimination. They're the strongest coefficients, except for this. The national orientation is negatively related to this constructed variable called ethnic contacts, ethnic orientation positively. Ethnic behaviors, which is mainly the ethnic contacts, 85. Integration is positively associated with both forms of adaptation. The ethnic orientation is positively associated with sociocultural adaptation, which is contrary to the earlier analysis using a different way of looking at the data, and is positively correlated or related to psychological adaptation. So integration and the orientation towards your ethnic group are promoting both sociocultural and psychological well-being. The last coefficient in here that I think is important to look at, as psychologists, we tend to believe that if you are doing well as an individual, if you have personal well-being, then you'll do well in school and you'll do well in the community. In other words, we expected that the arrow would go from psychological adaptation to sociocultural adaptation. But look what we got. It went the other way. It's the best fit when the arrow goes this way. People who are doing well in school and people who are doing well in the community have better psychological outcomes as well as sociocultural. So again, this shows the influence of the social context on the individual rather than the other way around, and it's a fairly substantial coefficient. Just 2 slides left, and we can have some discussion. So if we look at the points of view of the dominant, sometimes called mainstream or larger society and the points of view of the non-dominant or the minority or ethnocultural groups. And we look at levels at which we can think about the how question. What we've seen is that at the individual acculturation strategies, people clearly vary amongst themselves with a clear preference for the integrationist strategy. When we look at the larger society in our national surveys and in the ISATIS study that I mentioned briefly, we use a scale called multicultural ideology. To what extent do you think it's important for this country to have a variety of cultural groups which provide resources and opportunity and interest in our day-to-day lives? That's the integrationist ideology at the positive end, and at the negative end is assimilation. And both of these we've now measured. For example, in Canada, multicultural ideology is running a little over 78% on the positive side of the scale. It barely reaches 20% in France and Germany. So we see massive national differences. Somehow, and in Australia it's around 60%, somehow societies vary tremendously in the extent to which they accept the integrationist way of living. Both groups making mutual changes to accommodate each other, to allow all cultures to live with each other. At the national level, we have the goals of the various ethnocultural communities. For example, if you look at the Assembly of First Nations or at the Ukrainian National Coalition, all groups tend to have organizations with explicit goals. I don't know of a single cultural organization that has assimilation as its goal or exclusion. For example, anybody with a German drop of blood from the former Soviet Union can return as Aussiedler. We have a sample of those people in our study, by the way. And the national policies are clearly at odds with the goals of the groups themselves and the kinds of responses that we're getting when we do these studies. At the institutional level, which I think is probably of some interest to people here, Pamela will remember the title of the position paper that we developed at Queen's. It was called Towards Diversity and Equity at Queen's University. And I've applied this model to other universities and to health and military situations in Canada. Basically, the institutions, in order to achieve consistency between the group goals and the strategies of individuals, is to develop diversity, the acceptance and promotion of diversity, with equitable position of all points of view. There should not be a privileged cultural group. Or as we say at Queen's, just because the Scots got here and developed this university doesn't mean that it can remain a Scottish institution forever and ever. It's got to change. At the level of the dominant institutions, to what extent should they remain uniform, or can they become more and more plural? In the study with the military that I've been doing with Rudy Kalin, there is an old guard that says, what do you think the word uniform means? It means everybody's got to look and act the same. So then I point out that, well, women and men have different uniforms, and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force have different uniforms, different regiments. Some wear kilts and some don't, etc. Et cetera. Oh, no, that's not what I mean. You know, can't have turbans. Okay? So the debate between uniformity or pluralism, whether it's in the military or whether it's in faith-based arbitration of family conflict, which we've been having in Ontario, is the current locus of debate for the larger society. And increasingly, with these all pointing in the direction of the integrationist, that is to say, the double cultural orientation, the mutual change and mutual respect and acceptance of each other, it's almost impossible for the dominant society to remain adamant about uniformity in their societies. And if they do, I think it's at their own peril. Conclusions. Individual and group differences, very clear in how people go about their acculturation. It's also very clear there are variations in how well the outcomes are for them. They are related. There are systematic relationships. If you had to advise an institution, if you had to advise a government, if you had to advise an individual in a school setting about the best way to do it, our evidence clearly points away from assimilation and away from segregation, and particularly marginalization, and towards the integrationist view. And it is so common in our study, although we are excluding the vast majority of the world's population, it's so common in our data that in cross-cultural psychology we talk about a universal. It doesn't mean it's true everywhere, but the basic principle is at least worth trying out because it's an indicator of successful outcomes wherever we've looked at it. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I've gone a few minutes over the 60 minutes, but we do still have 20 minutes for conversation. Thanks. Do you want me to field the questions, or do you want to... Okay, I'll do that.
I do have a question.
Oh, okay.
On your finding with regard to the negative relationship between national identity and social cultural adaptation, I was a little puzzled by that. According to your definition of social cultural adaptation is kind of if a person does well in school and the person is liked by the teacher. I felt that intuitively, let's say, if an immigrant tries to adapt and do things the local way, shouldn't that
This, I mentioned, was at odds with our expectation. It's also at odds with the structural equation law. The national orientation has a slightly positive impact on sociocultural adaptation, whereas in the cluster analysis, it's not. These are two completely different ways of attacking the data. And at a conference in Germany in May, there was a big debate about whether it's legitimate to take the same data set and use conventional factor analytic techniques and cluster analytic techniques. And one person said it's like squeezing the sponge twice. You're only allowed to squeeze it once and get anything out of it. The rest. But others who know far more about statistics than I do said it's quite legitimate. There are totally different ways of understanding data set. So here, what you would expect in your question is borne out. But here it's not.
But does it make sense?
This does not make sense to us. The other makes sense.
So do you have any alternative explanation for why this would be the case?
Given the issue of discrimination, these are people who are trying to orient themselves towards the national society. Given the level of discrimination, at least among some groups, the rebuff may be sufficient to cause poor performance at school community. I can tell you, I mentioned Van Hockey's scale of discrimination. He did his PhD with me at Queen's using students in the Technikon in South Africa. These are technical universities mainly for African students. And there's a long debate about mental health and discrimination. Particularly in the U.S., it's claimed that those who experience discrimination have poor mental health. And Dan set out the following hypotheses. Those who experience a lot of discrimination and have an assimilationist orientation will have poor mental health because what they're trying to do is being thwarted. Whereas those who experience a lot of discrimination but have a separatist orientation towards living in a new society, they'll say, yeah, I knew this all along, and it doesn't bother them. So it may depend on a level of discrimination. It may depend on some other factors which we haven't. This is an overview of the main findings from the book. We have, Allah willing, another 20 years of data analysis to do on some of these primary-graded issues.
I'm not quite sure I can articulate this. I'm thinking of the UK, and I'm thinking when I go there now and I see the way that the culture has changed and that the foods have changed, the people of different origins everywhere, everybody's interacting, and it seems that there's a change in society itself. But then I listen to Blair, and it's still very much a Christian, white society. So how much does that higher level change in response to the immigrant community affect how the immigrant community sees its role in that society? Because at some point there's going to be a critical mass and it will shift because the voters will have the power, the political power to make that shift. Does anyone study that?
Yes. There is a research group led by Ian Nicholson in the British Home Office. I've been consulting with them in the last 2 years now. They originally approached me because they came across some of these ideas in the literature. And they're now setting up to do a longitudinal study, both of a panel of members of the larger society, non-immigrant, and selected immigrant groups, as a basis for developing politically acceptable policy. There's a book called Cultural Political Psychology by Stan Reschen and John Duckett, who's in Auckland. And in that, I had a chapter with Rudy Kaler that talks about the interplay between public attitudes and public policy on both sides, those who are already in the society and those who are immigrant to the society. It takes either a very, very courageous or very devious prime minister to get away with a major policy shift. The 1969 Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in this country clearly established that Anglo-conformity could no longer be a model for Canada to operate in. And book 3 of that report, called The Cultural Contributions of the Other Groups, set the stage for the acceptance that bilingualism or biculturalism was insufficient for the growing immigrant and ethnocultural populations. And in '69 we had the Official Languages Act, in '71 we had the multiculturalism policy, but not the act until '88. Trudeau was responsible for both. Of all prime ministers in recent Canadian history, he may have been the only one either sufficiently courageous or sufficiently devious to get away with it. Could Blair get away with it? Not without having public viewpoints understood and being used as a basis for moving society towards a more pluralist goal. So that's what this research group is working on. They want to study both sides, and they want to do it longitudinally. Of all the European countries, Britain stands out as closer to settler society in many of our variables. I don't know why. It's possible that they have stronger links with the other settler societies because of language, as was mentioned before. But Britain is clearly taking the lead. The Netherlands is retreating, dramatically retreating, because they simply didn't understand the second element of multiculturalism, and that is full-scale participation and change in the larger society in order to accommodate the needs of the people who now are citizens and taxpayers and voters in our society. Multiculturalism still, to a large extent in Europe and to a large extent in the US, means simply having a bunch of different cultural groups living in the same place at the same time, but no element for social integration, social participation, equity, and so on. Yes?
I don't think I overlooked this one. I'm wondering, from a framework of individualists and collectivists, was that anyway considered in the study? And do you have any speculation as to who acculturates them?
Don't believe it. I've written on the lack of validity of that distinction. There's a beautiful paper by Yuri and Anu in Estonia on individualism and collectivism in Estonia, which, according to Hofstede, is collectivist. They take 3 different kinds of samples: fishermen on an isolated island, long-term Estonians, housewives in Tallinn, and some military